Good morning. This is Dr. Garais, and this is the video lecture for any MED210 Anatomy and Physiology 2. Now, this particular section video, we'll be talking about Chapter 13, Spinal Cord and Reflexes, and of course we will be using Saladdin's 6th edition Anatomy and Physiology. Now, just to briefly touch up to where we're going to be at this week, I have scheduled makeup days on Tuesdays, December 2 and December 9. It's okay if you can't go, but what will I be doing so that you will be able to post attendance by those days? Well, I will have online quizzes for material that will be posted for December 2 and December 9. So, for example, for December 2, this Chapter 13, there will be a quiz available. And of course, regular classes on Wednesday, December 3 and December 10. Wednesday, December 3, we should be discussing Chapter 14. I'll have a video on that as well. There'll be a quiz on Chapter 17, Endocrine, on December 9. We'll be briefly reviewing these chapters on Wednesday, December 10, our next to last class meeting, and then final will be on December 17. We will discuss in class on what are we to do with these missing laboratories. And we're going to try to get the schedule, because as of right now, the schedule for December 5 and December 12, Friday, for the laboratories stand. So without further ado, let's get on with Chapter 13, Spinal Cord and Reflexes, and I believe it's around page 480 or so. Okay. So that's what we're going to be talking about, and this is the figure 13.1 on page 480. If you notice here, this is of course the spinal cord. Alright, it exits through that large opening, if you recall, on your skeletal system, the foramen magnum. Foramen means hole, magnum, large hole here in your skull, and that connects your spinal cord here to your brain. Remember that the spinal cord and the brain are central nervous system. Now, all of these little offshoots here, if you could see them on the video, maybe I'll even make them even closer. Oh, well, don't need closer. Here you go. All these little offshoots here from the spinal cord are your spinal nerves. And these big bulky things right here, these are called ganglion, which are simply a conglomerate or a group of nerves. Excuse me, as you can see, I'm a little bit under the weather. But don't matter, we're medical personnel. We move and groove even on supposed Black Friday. While everyone's out shopping, what are we doing? We are working. So these are spinal nerves. Your spinal nerves, there's 31 pairs. Remember, you have left and the right. Now, the 31 pairs are divided into 5 different categories. And just like your vertebra, they are categorized in their location. So the neck area, that'll be cervical. There are 8 cervical spinal nerves, or 8 pairs. And you may recall there are 7 cervical vertebrae, but there are 8 pairs, because remember, it goes in between the spaces. Thoracic, 1 through 12, to match the 12 ribs. Lumbar, 1 through 5, to match the 5 lumbar. Sacral, 1 through 5, to match the 5 fused bones of your sacrum. And of course, coccygeal, there's only 1, and it ends here and at what they call the terminal phylum, also known as your cauda equina. Cauda means tail, equina means horse. So we can kind of see, it looks like a horse's tail. So what kind of questions could I ask you? Spinal nerves, is it part of the central nervous system or peripheral nervous system? You will answer peripheral. Okay? Your spinal cord, is it part of the central nervous system or peripheral nervous system? Central nervous system, along with your brain. Up here, not pictured. Okay? I could also ask you, How many cervical? 8. How many thoracic? 12. How many lumbar? 5. How many sacral? 5. And how many coccygeal? 1. So, to recap, 8 pairs of cervical, 12 pairs of thoracic, 5 pairs of lumbar, 5 sacral, and only 1 single coccygeal, and a partridge in a pear tree. Now, there's coverings. Let's see if we can go to another picture. Oh, here's another nice picture of, you have your spinal cord here, right? And you could see here that there are different layers of coverings. And this is on page 481, figure, let's see if we can get a figure number here, figure 13.2. You could see here that there are different coverings. I like this picture right here because it's a nice cross section, transverse section of your spinal cord. And remember, this is your vertebrae, right? You see how it has those processes here, and it perfectly fits these spinal nerves. And again, you have a let me get my, this is the left, and let me see if I get my bearing right. Nope, this is the right and this is the left, because remember, this is a transverse section. Okay, and this is the anterior, right? So if my patient is facing on their belly here, these are the right and these are the left. So meninges right here. Let's look at that really big. Meninges, covering of the brain. You have 3 major coverings. The tough mother, or dura mater, is the dura or durable or tough last outer sheath, outer covering. The arachnoid is the middle, and the pia is the most intimate or thinnest layer. And remember what we always talked about. Everything tough is on the outside. Everything that more delicate is on the inside. And these are the coverings of your brain and spinal cord. And you could see here another layers of another way to look at it. So you have your tough layer, you have your middle arachnoid, and this pink part here is the pia. Okay? And remember, you have meningitis, you are in very, very big trouble. Because what's next to get infected? The very important part of your spinal cord. And your spinal nerves could be infected. And you could see how easily infection can go in there if we don't watch out. There's arteries and veins all over the inside. So we get very excited when the patient has sepsis. Sepsis is blood infection. And where does blood go? It goes everywhere. And if it goes everywhere, it can go within here. But we have these 3 layers. You have the tough outer, the arachnoid, and they call it the arachnoid. You may remember arachnoid, arachnid means spider, oid means spider-like, because it's a spider-like web. It's like kind of, and I like the way they drew it here. It's like very webby looking middle layer. And you have, of course, the most intimate layer, the closest layer to your spinal cord, which is the pia. Okay? So that's a nice question there. And what's important about each layer, if you look at the notes, right, the epidural space, which is in between the dura and the arachnoid, there's very important because they have blood vessels. And that is the important space, the epidural space, where we can put and deliver anesthesia, and also we can also assess the cerebral spinal fluid. The arachnoid matter, web-like, that houses the cerebral spinal fluid. We can grab them from there. So arachnoid layer, cerebral spinal fluid, epidural space underneath the dura, and the pia is the most delicate covering. Now, let's talk about tracts. T-R-A-C-T-S. We're not looking at pathology. Let's look at tracts. There are certain parts of the spinal cord that go up and certain parts of the spinal cord that go down. Now, it happens on both sides. So if you look at that, they just purposely put all the descending tracks on the right side and all the ascending tracks on the left side. But they're on the left and right side, they have ascending and descending tracks. Remember, it is important to understand that these tracks or pathways, once they are destroyed, you can't rebuild them. So it's very, very important that we keep them safe. So let's look at what does an ascending track mean. And again, I'm also looking at my notes, item number 2, which is ascending versus descending tracks. So the ascending track is sensory, also known as afferent. So an ascending track, that means the message has to come from your body and it goes up the spinal cord, right, and then to your brain. Like for example, you stub your toe. The pain from the toe goes all throughout the nerves, and then the nerves go into the spinal nerves here, right? And then once the spinal nerves hit the spinal cord, then it goes all the way up to the brain. And that's an ascending track, also known as an afferent pathway. Now a descending pathway is a motor pathway. In order for you to move your foot or to hold your foot in pain, you need to have a message from your brain. So the brain is assumed somewhere up here. And then it goes down. And then it goes down to your foot so you can hop around on your feet and do whatever dance you do after you stub your toe on the coffee table in the middle of the night. So you could see here that the posterior column, right, and these posterior tracks, and the anterior spinocerebellar tract, these tracks are ascending. And what are the descending tracks? Most of the descending tracks are lateral and medial. Okay? So when you think ascending tracks, you're going to think mostly posterior and a little bit of anterior. And when you're talking about descending tracks, most of them are what? They're mostly lateral, medial, and of course with a little bit anterior. Right? Eventually, you're going to be having to memorize all these tracks if you want to go to medical school. But right now, before we go to medical school, let's just know that ascending tracks, they're more where? They're more towards the back and to the side, right? And the descending tracks are more towards the front and to the medial lateral. Okay? And ascending tracks are afferent, descending tracks are efferent, or exiting the brain. Okay? We also have different classifications of nerves, and we can go to page 489. And here's another view of ascending and descending tracks, and you see these ascending tracks. They come up, boop, 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 all the way up, and then up to the brain. Okay. And if ever you have to learn these, the best way to do it is draw it. Now, descending tracks. They start from up here, and they exit the brain. They start at the cerebrum. Then, of course, the midbrain, and then they go down, 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 and out. Right? Then, of course, some goes to skeletal muscles. And it makes sense. They're motor. You want to motor, you want to move something. So it's got to be descending. It has to start in the brain. It could also be visceral, like blood vessels, glands, and guts. Those are viscera. So let's hop on to page 489. All right. Table 13.2, 489. Where's the table 13.2? Here you go. Here's a nice thing about the nerves. You can also see nerves. Doesn't look familiar? They go in bundles too, like wires. You have unmyelinated and myelinated. They also have what? Coverings. Epineurium, perineurium. Just like muscles. You got to admit that's not coincidence. just like any other wire. And also, you'll notice that they're blood vessels. This nerve has to keep alive. So you like depriving yourself of oxygen. What could you deprive yourself of? The signals. And it makes sense. Now let's look at 13.2. We're talking about afferent and efferent. This is table 13.2 on page 489. You have afferent versus efferent. We already talked about that. Somatic versus visceral. Somatic do what? Stuff with your skeletal muscles, bones, and joints. Visceral is your blood vessels, glands, and viscera. The somatic stuff you can control. The visceral stuff you can't. Think about it. Can I control my blood pressure by thinking, hey, blood pressure, drop. Hey, blood pressure, increase? You can't. But I can control somatic, soma, pertaining to your body. I can control my body. Then you have generalized fibers and then specialized fibers. Specialized fibers, and we're going to talk about the special senses, that has to do with pretty much anything that's on your head or on your skull. Facial expression, olfactory, which is smell, eyes, ears, hearing, taste, chewing. Those are special, and they are localized organs in the head. Okay? Alright, so those are the classifications. You need to know those. Let's see. In my next note, I had a little side note. Plexus is a network of nerves. Let's see if there's a, here is an example of a, let's see if there's an example of a plexus. Here's a little bit more detail. And this is on page 491. Figure 13.10. Here's a little bit more detail. And they also have plexi, or cervical plexus, brachial plexus. Now, a plexus is a network of nerves, so it's a whole bunch of nerves put together. And there are three major ones that you need to know. Cervical deals with the stuff on the neck, C1 through C5. Brachial, that stuff offshoots and goes through all the nerves and it runs through this big network that's on your upper arm, on your arm, right around the area of your axillary area, which is armpit, and that is cervical 5 through thoracic 1. And last but not least, he goes your lumbar plexus, L1, L4. You also have sacral plexus, L4 to S4. Do understand that I won't really be asking you like which plexus is what, but eventually you'll need to know. But just know that cervical, that's where? Somewhere around my neck. Brachial, that's on my arm. Your brachium, upper arm. Your lumbar, that's where? Lower back. Sacral, even lower back. Coccygeal, all the way on the bottom. Okay? And those are plexus. And the three quick examples that I gave in the notes are cervical, brachial, and lumbar, but they're more. Alrighty? Another very, very clean view. And you can see even more protection. See these muscles? They're called the strap muscles. And there's a whole bunch of muscles running up and down your back that kind of fortify all of this. And that's a beautiful, beautiful picture of spinal cord. And then you see the spinal nerves. Very nice. Another picture. And you can see how, I know we don't talk about pathology in this particular class, but you could see how, right here, if you have this intervertebral disc, this cartilage here, you could see if it protrudes out, you could see how it can cause pain. You could start to impinge on this ganglion, which is a group of nerves that's going to mess with your spinal nerves. You could easily see it. And you could easily see how when someone's paralyzed, it loses innervation with the muscles in your lung cavity, or lining your lung cavity. It causes a whole bunch of problems. Now, this rest of this chapter is pathology. Remember, we do not go over pathology. There are also greater, again, for those of you who want to go to medical school, greater detail on the plexi or plexuses. I don't know. And you can see these parts are called C1, C2, they're called roots, and then they branch off to a whole bunch of things. What up? Oh, there you go. Right, here's some more real life pictures. Right, some nerves. Lumbar plexus, sacral plexus, coccygeal. Now, what's a dermatome? Tomi, remember to cut. Derma, skin. So they cut the skin into sections, and that's what a dermatome is. So you're going to have some cervical nerves, and it's usually with respect to sensory stuff. So you can see where the cervical, and then of course the thoracic would be the thoracic area, the lumbar here. Remember what I talked about? S2, S3, S4, the sacral, around the genital area. That's why having a saddle injury, it'll affect sacral nerves 2, 3, and 4. And look at what 2, 3, and 4 cover. That's not a good place to have an injury. Lumbar, ask any of your family members who have lumbar problems. Do they walk very well? Nope, because look what it innervates. L2, L3, L4, L5. Even sacral. Look at that. Right. Makes sense. And it's highly organized. Now let's talk about reflexes. Now first of all, what's the definition of a reflex? Right here, it's a quick, involuntary, stereotyped, excuse me, because I'm just going to pause this and I'm going to continue in a second. Sorry about that. Alright, we're back to the definition of reflexes. They're quick, involuntary, stereotyped reactions of glands and muscles to stimulation. Now, what does that mean? Now, typically, you know, when you have a like, let's say, for example, you stepped on like a piece of Lego or a rock, right? You have a sensory or an ascending message up to your brain that says, "Hey, you stepped on a rock." And then your brain processes it and then sends a message down to do what? Move your foot out of the way. That's kind of a long process. Well, reflexes were invented because we need involuntary reactions to things. Like, for example, what's a classic example of a reflex? You know, when you're cooking and a little bit of oil goes in your arm and you could pull your hand, and actually, you're not only pulling your hand, you're pulling your entire body away from the danger. Well, guess what? A lot of that does not require the brain. It doesn't require that long pathway of sensory that goes all the way up to the brain, and then the brain processes it and then sends a message all the way back down. Because by the time that happens, you'll be burned, or you wouldn't be able to run away from danger. So it's involuntary. You're not thinking about it. And stereotyped. What does stereotype mean? It means you will do the same thing every time, right? So, for example, the reflex of when you burned your hand. You moved it away from the stove the same way. You jumped back using your same foot every time, right? And it's made by the same stimulation. Your hand got burned, so that's what you're going to do. So, what are reflexes? They require stimulation, right? Something that will spark an ascending tract, right? Then, another thing about reflexes are they are quick, okay? They happen much faster because they do not, I repeat, do not require the brain nor any processing. It just happens, right? Reflexes are also involuntary. You cannot control them. They'll happen. Once the stimulus is there, for example, you get scared or you burn your hand, you will move away from the danger. And lastly, reflexes are stereotyped. They move the same exact way every time. So let's look at the reflex arc. There's got to be a picture of it somewhere. We could talk about it all day, but here you go. Here's the reflex arc. And that's on page 503, figure 13.21. And this is a typical reflex, the patellar reflex, which when we're in class, I guess we can play around with this, and we can show you how it works. So first of all, what do reflexes need? They need a stimulus. So here's a stimulus. I hit you right here on your patellar tendon. Remember, your patella is your kneecap, and there's a tendon there that connects your kneecap to your tibia, and boop, right? It shows that there's a little bit of stretch. So number 2, the stretch signal goes up. Remember, that's a what? Ascending. Now, instead of going to the brain, it'll go through here, through a set of interneurons. Interneurons are located at the level of the spinal cord. Now, there's another signal that goes all the way up to the brain, but by the time it gets to the brain, the action of this of me hitting your knee will be done. And then once we have the interneuron sending a signal now to what? Your efferent fibers. Okay? So your efferent fibers, they send messages down, and what does it tell your quadriceps to do? It tells your quadriceps to do what? Kick. Alright? Also known as your hamstrings. So let's go over that, and I'm not really following this, but you have your stimulus here. The stimulus sends a message to your efferent. Right? I'm sorry, not efferent. Through your afferent. The afferent then goes through the interneuron and then sends a message to the efferent to do what? Kick. And notice there are 2 signals. One signal to suppress, remember, muscles come in pairs. One signal to suppress one side and another signal to make the other side contract. Remember, just like your bicep and tricep, if I'm flexing my arm, the bicep has to contract and the tricep has to relax. So there are actually 2 motor fiber messages. One, contract. The other one, to the other side, don't contract, so that the foot will now what? Kick. And if you'll notice, it does not require the brain. It only requires what? Sensory, afferent tract, interneuron, efferent tract, and that's it. So that's a nice picture on how reflexes go. And that's figure 13.21, page 503 in your text. Grab all my notes here. Right. All right, that is chapter 13, Spinal Cord and Reflexes. Now, hello again. This is Dr. Garais, and this is MED210, Anatomy and Physiology 2. And now we're going to talk about the brain and cranial nerves. Now, let's start. And this is page 511, 512 of your textbook. And let's talk about first, before we begin, let's talk about some directions. Also looking at my notes, item 1, rostral is towards the nose, caudal is toward the tail. Sulci and gyri. Sulci are the depressions or the grooves within your brain, and the gyrus or gyri are the elevations or the bumps in your brain. Okay? And let's look at some major landmarks. Okay, so we see here, these are rostral, towards your nose, caudal, And these pictures, beautiful, beautiful pictures. All I have to do is take them and remove all of these and put A, B, C, D. If you notice that the cerebrum is separated into hemispheres, a left and a right, and there's a longitudinal fissure that separates the brain into these left and right hemispheres. Just like the cranial bones, which protect the brain, there are the lobes of the brain, or major sections of the brain, are labeled accordingly. Frontal lobe for the front. There's also a central sulcus here. Parietal lobe is in the back. Occipital lobe is in the very, very back. Then you have other stuff that you should know already. Spinal cord, cerebellum. Again, the cerebrum is this entire area, right? And then you have here the lateral sulcus. And of course, here's your temporal lobe. Okay? And here's a real brain. Now, do understand that sulcus means those depressions, these little grooves in here, and the gyrus is the big tubey or tube-like bumps. Okay? Alright, let's look at each section and what they do. Let's go back here. Best is look at this. So, let's look at the cerebrum. That's the major part. And if you look at my notes, they're responsible for conscious thought, memory storage and processing, conscious and subconscious control of muscle contraction. And, of course, there are different lobes. The frontal lobe is for voluntary conscious action, foresight, planning, and judgment. One of the things that we ask judgment questions to patients. For example, if you found if you saw somebody drop $100 bill on the ground, what would you do? We're looking for an answer that you'd either pick it up, keep it for yourself, or pick it up and give it to the person, because that's common. It's something of anyone's educational background would say. Either of those two things. If the patient can't decide or doesn't know what to do, then there could be a potential problem with the frontal lobe. Sometimes we ask the patient to memorize, 3 or 4 numbers or 3 or 4 letters in sequence. If they cannot do that, that means there may be a frontal lobe problem, because the frontal lobe deals with voluntary motor, foresight, planning, and judgment. We also, for frontal lobe, we make, like those sobriety tests that the police make you do. If they suspect you of driving under the influence, or DUI, they make you, touch your hand with your nose and all that kind of thing. Parietal lobe. Let's find the parietal lobe right here. The parietal lobe, that deals with general senses and some visual processing. The occipital lobe is the principal visual center. Now remember, parietal has some visual, but it's the occipital lobe back here has the main visual center. The temporal lobe right here, that deals with hearing, smell, learning, and some memory and emotion. Right? Let's look on, I have a note here, see figure 14.13 on page 531. So let's jump to page 531. Oh, here's another one. Here's another way to look at it. Right? That's pretty. And if you see here, they're resecting the insular area here. Oh, so many. Okay, one moment. Okay, sorry for the many interruptions. All right, so let's now look at the cerebellum. Let me go back to our original picture. Oh, here's a nice. Again. Now, do you see this central part? And this is your cerebellar cortex. Okay? It coordinates major complex motor patterns, adjusts the output of somatic centers in the brain and spinal cord. All right? This area, this major, and this is a cross section of your brain. Like if we cut open the brain, and I'm trying to get back to our original picture. So we're always talking about the same thing. There you go. There's our original picture. All right. So your cerebrum. Now, this little thing right down here is called your cerebellum. Item 2B in the notes coordinates complex motor patterns and adjusts the output of somatic centers in the brain. Now, your brainstem, which is here, right? This part right here that connects into your spinal cord. The brainstem connects to the brain via the spinal cord, and that has the vital functions, also known as your arbor vitae. Here you go. Here's a better picture. This is a cross section, and you could see here the cerebellum here. And it kind of, if you look at side view, kind of looks like a tree. And that's why they call it the arbor vitae. And this is your cerebellum, this whole thing right here. This is your midbrain. Midbrain has the pons. Here's midbrain, pons, and medulla, and then it connects into your spinal cord. This picture on page 515, very, very important for laboratory, very, very important for identification. This will definitely come out. So, let's look at some of these other parts here. The brainstem, which is this whole part here. Alright? Pons, which is part of the brainstem, right here. The function of the pons is to relay sensory to the cerebellum and the thalamus, subconscious, somatic, and visceral motor centers. The medulla oblongata, which is here, is part of the brainstem, relays sensory information to other brains and the thalamus. Autonomic center for visceral vital functions. Your autonomic center here. Remember? Things that you cannot control. Auto means self. This is part of the brain that puts you on autopilot for many of your functions. Now, keep on talking about the thalamus. Here's the thalamus. It is right here, dead center of this cross section. Now, what is the thalamus? It's located between the cerebral cortex and the midbrain. Here's the midbrain. Here's a cerebral cortex, and it's right in here. The function is to regulate consciousness, sleep, and alertness, right? This is the thing that gets messed up, you know, when you're jet lagged or when you don't sleep right. The hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus, if this is the thalamus, the hypothalamus has to be right underneath it. And the hypothalamus is part of the limbic system, which is a part of this right here, which is your corpus callosum. Now, what is the limbic system? The limbic system deals with your emotions. Okay? And then they want us to go back to figure 513. That's what it says in my notes. And again, this is yet another view of all of the things that we discussed. Okay? And again, back to 515. I wrote in big letters in the notes, know this anatomy. This will come out. Definitely. Let's look at the meninges. We talked about the meninges in the previous chapter. And here's another beautiful picture of the meninges. Actually, this is a nice picture because it shows all the layers. It shows the skull layer. It shows the dura. And you could see the arachnoid, how it's like kind of like web-like. And what was in the arachnoid? You see these blood vessels in there? Alright. Okay, and the pia mater is the thinnest layer here. It's like so thin. It's almost see-through. And the arachnoid layer here, you could see it's all that web-like. See all the little things sticking out, web-like. And that's a beautiful cross-section. And this is nice to know too. Definitely know it on paper, but this is also good to know. I could easily do A, B, C, D, E right here. You can see the brain is made out of gray matter and white matter. If you notice inside the brain, the white matter is on the inside and the gray matter is on the outside. On the spinal cord, it's reversed. Now you will also notice that within your brain there's canals and there's other spaces. Everyone see this nice gray part here. All these gray parts here. Those are the areas of where your body will house your cerebrospinal fluid. And remember, the cerebrospinal fluid is continuous from your cerebrum, which is your brain, and your spinal cord. And there are spaces. And these spaces, for example, let's look at a real brain here, a nice cross section here. There's these spaces in your brain. They're called ventricles. Okay? Now you have 4 ventricles. You have 2 lateral ones, as you can see here from this view. You have a 3rd ventricle here and a 4th ventricle here. You have 2 lateral, a 3rd ventricle, and a 4th ventricle. Here's your 2 lateral. One here, one there. Your 3rd ventricle here. Where's the 4th one? And the 4th one not pictured here. Okay? Now, let's go to page 519. Oh, we are in page 519. Let's go on this page. Now, you can see how vital the cerebrospinal fluid is. It innervates all parts of your brain. It is produced in the choroid plexus of your vein. And it has 4 very important functions. First, immunologic protection. Your brain and spinal cord must be sterile, meaning to say no viruses, no bacteria, no nothing in there except brain and brain stuff. So anything that gets in there, the cerebrospinal fluid will make sure they take it and flush it away. A physical cushion. Think about when your head gets bashed in by something. Your brain is floating in this water, so it makes it a little bit more difficult for the brain, kind of like to absorb some of the impact. Third, chemical stability. It maintains the proper pH and blood pressure within the brain. Remember, the pH must be what? Near physiologic, around 7.2, 7.4. We can't be too basic. We can't be too acidic. And same thing with the pressure. Blood pressure has to be maintained. And the way it all gets maintained is through the cerebral spinal fluid. And it also, of course, clears waste products. Remember, your brain is an organ just like anything else. And it uses, when it uses up energy, it creates waste. And the cerebral spinal fluid, and you see all these arrows? Arrows, arrows, arrows. It means what? That this is constantly flowing. If you have any obstruction to this flow, too much water, too much cerebral spinal fluid, too little cerebral spinal fluid, we have problems. Okay? This is a nice picture. Not really for identification, but for understanding that the cerebral spinal fluid is constantly flowing. And if you look here, here is some choroid plexus here in the 4th ventricle. And here's some more choroid plexus here in the 3rd ventricle. And those are sources of cerebral spinal fluid. And remember, there has to be a balance. So what do? Immunologic protection, physical cushion, chemical stability, which is pH and blood pressure, and lastly, clears the waste products of the brain. And here's some more other protection. Buoyancy. The brain floats on this cerebral spinal fluid. Alrighty. Now, let's talk about the blood supply. Now, the blood supply is only 2% of your adult body weight, but guess what? It takes a whole bunch of blood supply. Okay? 15% of the blood supply, 20% of the oxygen, because neurons have a much higher demand for energy in the form of glucose and in the form of oxygen and in the form of metabolic fuel, ATP, also known as adenosine triphosphate. All right? Any interruption within the system of consciousness, 1 to 2 minutes, neurologic function. And the golden 5 minutes or the golden 4 minutes, within 4 minutes you have irreversible brain damage. That's why everything in the hospital, everything in medical is under a time constraint. We must always, because the second my patient stops breathing, I have a problem, because one of the main problems is the brain can't last too long without its fuel. And the major sources of fuel are glucose, oxygen, and ATP. Alright. The brain, remember, the brain is also sterile. There cannot be any antibodies. There can't be, well, there are antibodies in there, but there can't be any harmful agents like bacteria or viruses or anything in there. So the brain also has something called the blood-brain barrier. This regulates, now there are 2 potential points of entry right here. We're looking at your textbook. The blood-brain barrier is one of them. Now, the blood-brain barrier is a bunch of kind of like skin cells, and they're because the only way really in is through the blood vessels, specifically the capillaries. Now, they have these skin cells that kind of form like a mesh, right? And the same thing also happens in the choroid plexus of the blood CSF barrier. Now, the function of these 2 systems is to do what? Is to pretty much filter all the bad stuff. So they're permeable to good things, such as water, glucose, and lipid-soluble items. Other items included are oxygen, carbon dioxide, alcohol, caffeine, and nicotine. So you could see that there are certain chemicals, certain drugs that go right through it. All right? So the 2 points of entry are, in my notes, where I included the blood-brain barrier, and I forgot to write it on the capillaries of the choroid plexus, which is the blood CSF barrier. All right? So those are the 2 major points of entry to the blood supply. And you can see the brains that we have for chemicals, that's what we use. Now the rest of the chapter, a little bit more detail, but let us now get to another part of my notes where we have all the cranial nerves. Now, if you look at the midbrain, figure 14.8 on page 523, you don't need to know this now. You go to medical school, you're going to figure all this out. But you're going to have all these nerves, and they're sprouting all from the midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata. And I have a list of all these nerves that are included in your notes that I have posted on Moodle today. The rest of the other chapter, there's some developmental stuff, don't need to know. Here's another picture of the limbic system, or your emotions. Okay. Here's the corpus callosum. Here's the corpus callosum here, that connects the left and the right. But all around the corpus callosum, what do you see? all that purple stuff deals with emotion. Here's an example of an EEG, electroencephalogram. What is it measuring? It measures the brain waves, and we usually like doing it in a sleep study because your brain is most active when you are asleep. Right? And these are different kinds of waves, and depending on the presence of these waves. And this is also part of my commercial on the importance of sleep. And these are the stages of sleep. You don't need to know that. You'll probably learn that in your psychology class too. Cognition is the mental process where you like understand stuff, where you use your knowledge and previous memory. And remember, it says association areas. Remember I talked to you about chunking? That's how you understand stuff, and you start putting those together. Now, memory is different. Memory is not only physical; it's also chemical. Right? So, chemical and electrical, and it's really highly complex. They only have medical science has only a general idea of how memory works. But we're working on it. But here's the one thing that we do know: that it's chemical, that it's electrical. So please get some sleep, because that is when your brain does all the work and organizing all the thoughts, so that you can understand things, cognition, and that you can recall them, and that's memory. What's going on? And that's how we pretty much figured out certain parts of the brain, because of people who get into accidents. Sensation. Now, special senses we'll be talking about in another lecture. This is what is called the homunculus. There's certain parts of your cerebrum that have to do certain parts like that, and this is exaggerated. Like the tongue would take up this part, and the nose, and all that other stuff. Right? And that's for sensory. So that part of the brain was the lips, and you could see the parts of the brain that are very, very sensitive. See that? The tongue has a big part. The lips have a lot of part as well. Alright, we already talked about ascending and descending tracks already. Alright, and the rest are, I believe they're for special senses. Now, let's go through. Let's see if we got, how much time we got left. We got a couple more minutes left, but from page 549 onward, there's a very highly detailed description of your cranial nerves. Well, I took a similar chart and made it just as easy. Now, what do you need to know from the cranial nerves? You need to know their names. Like, for example, number 1 is olfactory, number 2 is optic, 3 oculomotor, so on and so forth. Then you need to know which ones are sensory, which ones are motor, or which ones are both, right? And the function usually deals with the fact that if it's sensory or it's motor or both, right? So let's look at one example, and then the rest of them we can review in class as a quick review. But after you do one or two, you'll get the point. So let's look at the first one. Cranial Nerve One. And notice that the cranial nerves are labeled in Roman numerals. And the abbreviation is capital C, capital N, with a Roman numeral 1. So Cranial Nerve 1, what is it? Olfactory. Olfactory means what? Your smell. So it's sensory. So what does the olfactory nerve do? It deals with your smell. So you can see here, this is your nose and this is your superior turbinate, and with all these olfactory nerves, and then it goes right to Cranial Nerve One and goes right into your brain. Okay? So the worst I could ask you is, what's Cranial Nerve One? Olfactory. What number is it? 1. Number 2. Number 2 is in the bottom of that first page. Number 2, optic nerve. Of course, optic, ic, pertaining to vision. Sensory is vision. It deals with your retina. Makes sense. Alright, that concludes, you can go over the rest of the lecture, and that concludes our lecture for today. And please look on Moodle for extra assignments, and the quiz for this chapter 13 and chapter 14 will be posted on December 2. Alright, and please do understand it will be posted during a short period of time. Okay, so please make sure to check your Moodle daily. Alright, I hope everyone had a happy Thanksgiving, and I will see you on Wednesday evening, December 3rd. Thank you. See you on Monday.